Joseph appears at the most critical moment in the story of Jesus, receiving angelic warnings, protecting a young mother, and saving a child destined to change the world. And then, without explanation, he vanishes. No death recorded, no farewell spoken, no trace left behind. As Jesus steps into public ministry, the man who raised him is suddenly gone. This silence is not accidental, it is deliberate, layered, and deeply significant. Hidden within Scripture is a mystery most believers never notice, yet once seen, it changes how we understand Jesus, the Father, and the cross itself. If you find this investigation compelling, take a moment to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. Then, stay with us, because what comes next reveals why this silence matters. At the beginning of the gospel narrative, Joseph stands in a position of unexpected prominence. In both Matthew and Luke, he is not introduced as a minor background character, but as a decisive figure through whom the earliest events of the Incarnation unfold. Without Joseph, the opening chapters would lose coherence, protection, and continuity. His presence provides structure at the moment when divine intervention enters ordinary human history. Matthew's Gospel introduces Joseph immediately and intentionally. He is described as a righteous man, a term that in Jewish thought signifies far more than moral goodness. Righteousness implies alignment with God's law, faithfulness in action, and a willingness to submit personal desire to divine command. This description sets the framework for everything Joseph does. He is not driven by impulse or emotion, but by discernment and obedience. What distinguishes Joseph in the Nativity story is how God communicates with him. Unlike other figures who receive public signs or spoken prophecies, Joseph encounters God through dreams. These dreams are not symbolic or vague. They are direct, authoritative instructions that require trust and immediate response. When the angel speaks, Joseph does not argue, negotiate, or delay. He acts. This pattern defines his role. Each time divine direction is given, Joseph responds without recorded hesitation. The gospel does not linger on his internal struggle. It emphasizes outcome rather than emotion. Joseph rises, takes Mary as his wife, protects her from public disgrace, and accepts responsibility for a child not biologically his own. In doing so, he becomes the legal guardian of the Messiah, a role without precedent in Jewish history. Joseph's obedience is not passive, it is active and costly. He places himself in a position of social risk, accepting a situation that could invite misunderstanding or suspicion. Yet the Gospels never portray him seeking justification or explanation. His righteousness is quiet. His faith is demonstrated through action, not speech. As the narrative unfolds, Joseph's role expands from husband to protector. When danger arises, it is Joseph who receives the warning. The instruction is urgent and unambiguous. Take the child and his mother and flee. Again, the response is immediate. The Gospel highlights the decisiveness of the action, underscoring Joseph's function as the human safeguard through which God preserves the life of Jesus. The journey to Egypt places Joseph in the role of leader and provider. He navigates uncertainty, displacement, and risk without commentary. The text does not romanticize the journey. It simply records obedience. Joseph acts as the stabilizing force holding together a vulnerable family at the center of an extraordinary divine plan. When the threat passes, Joseph is again instructed to move. He returns from Egypt only to be redirected once more. Each relocation reinforces his role as a man guided by divine instruction rather than personal preference. He does not settle permanently until directed to do so. His life is shaped entirely by responsiveness to God's leading. Throughout these events, one detail remains consistent. Joseph never speaks. The Gospels record no words from him. His character is revealed entirely through decisions. He is silent, yet decisive. Present, yet never seeking attention. His authority is functional, not performative. In Luke's account, Joseph appears as a lawful, observant Jew, fulfilling required customs and ensuring that every obligation is met. He provides legitimacy and stability within the community. His presence grounds the incarnation in real human structures, family, law, and daily life. Through him, the extraordinary enters the ordinary without chaos. Joseph's prominence in these opening chapters is intentional. He serves as the human framework that allows the incarnation to unfold without disruption. He absorbs risk, provides protection, and maintains order while remaining in the background. The narrative depends on him, yet never centers on him. And then, just as firmly as he entered the story, Joseph fades from it. Not gradually, not symbolically, not with explanation. After the account of Jesus at 12 years old in Jerusalem, Joseph is never mentioned again. The story continues without pause, but the man who once stood at the center of Jesus' early life is suddenly absent. This is not a subtle transition. It is abrupt and deeply unsettling once noticed. There is no farewell scene. There is no verse recording his death. There is no burial, no mourning, no reflection. Joseph simply vanishes from the text. This absence becomes even more striking when placed beside the broader pattern of Scripture. The Bible is not careless with endings. When significant figures exit the story, their departures are usually marked. Abraham's death is recorded with care. Moses' final moments are described in detail. David's death is noted and located. Even lesser-known figures often receive brief notices when they die. Scripture understands closure. Joseph receives none. This raises an unavoidable question: why? The Gospel writers clearly knew how to record death. They had no hesitation doing so elsewhere. John the Baptist's execution is described, Herod's demise is noted, Judas's end is remembered. The absence of any such record for Joseph cannot be explained as oversight or forgetfulness. It is a choice, and that choice creates silence. What makes this silence powerful is how naturally readers sense it. Even without formal training, attentive readers often pause and ask, "What happened to Joseph?" The question arises not because the text tells us to ask it, but because the absence feels unnatural. A father figure does not normally disappear from a story without explanation, especially one so closely connected to the central character. The Gospels do not answer the question. They leave it hanging. This restraint is deliberate. The writers do not speculate. They do not offer assumptions. They do not insert commentary to satisfy curiosity. Instead, they allow the silence to remain. In doing so, they signal that whatever happened to Joseph is no longer central to the story they are now telling. This is where silence becomes narrative. Rather than functioning as a gap or weakness, the absence operates like a boundary. It marks a transition in the story's direction. Up to this point, the narrative has been concerned with origins, protection, and preparation. After this point, the focus shifts toward identity, authority, and mission. Joseph belongs entirely to the former. Once the story crosses that threshold, he is no longer mentioned. Importantly, the Gospels do not remove Joseph by replacing him with another earthly authority figure. There is no surrogate father, no mentor stepping into the role, no explanation that smooths the transition. The absence is clean. The story moves forward, unburdened by domestic detail. This restraint protects the narrative from distraction. Had the Gospel writers recorded Joseph's death, readers would naturally linger there. Attention would turn backward to loss, grief, and resolution. Instead, the text presses forward. The silence prevents the story from slowing down. It keeps the focus on what is about to be revealed, not on what has already passed. This technique appears throughout the Gospels. The writers often compress years into sentences and omit details that modern readers might expect. They are not writing biographies in the modern sense. They are constructing testimonies, carefully shaped proclamations about who Jesus is and what his life means. In that framework, Joseph's fate is secondary. What matters is not how Joseph exited, but that he no longer occupies space in the narrative. His absence clears the stage. It allows Jesus to step fully into view without being defined by a visible paternal presence. The silence does not diminish Joseph's importance. It confirms that his role has been completed. Readers instinctively feel this shift. The story begins to feel different. The emphasis changes. Jesus is no longer presented primarily within a family context. He is encountered, publicly questioned, challenged, observed. The lack of a named present father alters how others perceive him and how the narrative unfolds. And yet, the Gospels never draw attention to this shift directly. They trust the reader to notice. That trust reveals confidence. The writers do not feel the need to explain every transition. They allow silence to carry meaning. Joseph's disappearance functions as a narrative signal. The story has moved into a new phase, and the categories that once defined Jesus are no longer sufficient. From this point on, identity will no longer be grounded in household structure or family roles. Authority will no longer be borrowed from lineage. The silence surrounding Joseph prepares the ground for claims that cannot be supported or challenged by ordinary human relationships. So Joseph disappears, not because he is forgotten, not because his story lacks importance, but because the story itself has advanced beyond the place where he belongs. And the Gospels, through disciplined restraint, allow that silence to speak louder than explanation ever could. In the world Jesus grew up in, names were never spoken lightly. They told people who you were before you ever opened your mouth. A name revealed where you belonged, who stood behind you, and how seriously others should take you. In villages like Nazareth, identity did not come from personal achievement. It came from lineage, from your father, from the house you were born into. Everyone understood this. So when Jesus returned home and began to speak in public, the people listening did what people always did. They tried to place him. They searched for something familiar, something that would make sense of the authority in his voice. And then they spoke the words that quietly unsettled everything. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary? The question sounds simple, almost casual. But in that moment, something is missing. Something that should be there but isn't. Joseph's name is not spoken. In first-century Jewish life, that omission was not neutral. Men were not identified through their mothers. Ever. A man's public identity flowed through his father's name, his father's reputation, his father's standing in the community. To call someone son of, without naming the father, was to break the expected pattern, and everyone would have noticed. For the people of Nazareth, this phrasing would have landed with weight. It suggested absence without saying it. It allowed listeners to draw their own conclusions. In many cases, identifying a man by his mother implied that the father was no longer present, often because he had died. No announcement was needed. The wording carried the meaning on its own. Joseph does not need to be mentioned for his absence to be felt. But the phrase carries more than one layer. In a tightly woven village, where everyone remembered everyone else's story, breaking naming convention could also signal distance. It subtly marked someone as different, familiar yet unsettled, known yet difficult to place. Jesus is not a stranger to them, but he no longer fits neatly into the structure they recognize. Matthew tells the same moment differently. The crowd asks, "Is this not the carpenter's son?" Joseph is still not named. He appears only as a role, a trade, a memory. The father exists, but only in outline, not as a presence, not as a voice. Luke is even more careful. When introducing Jesus at the beginning of his ministry, he writes that Jesus was the son, as was supposed, of Joseph. The phrase hangs in the air, as was supposed. It acknowledges what people believed while quietly loosening its grip. The connection is assumed, not confirmed. The language leaves space, and that space matters. Across these moments, a pattern forms not through explanation, but through repetition. Joseph is never allowed to stand beside Jesus in the public imagination. His name fades, his role softens, his presence recedes into assumption rather than reality. This changes how Jesus is seen. In a culture where authority flowed through fathers, the absence of a clearly named patriarch leaves Jesus exposed. There is no household to point to, no reputation to borrow, no fathers standing to shield him from questions. This is why people keep asking where his authority comes from, why his words unsettle them, why his confidence feels unearned and therefore threatening. Without a visible father, Jesus stands alone. The language forces this isolation. By reducing Joseph to a reference rather than a presence, the story prevents Jesus from being explained away as the product of family influence. He is not introduced as someone whose authority naturally flows from upbringing. He speaks as if his authority originates elsewhere. Joseph's disappearance from speech mirrors his disappearance from the story. He becomes a point of origin, not a continuing force. He explains how Jesus entered the world, but not how Jesus understands himself. The words people use to describe Jesus quietly reinforce this shift. They stop anchoring him in Joseph. They stop leaning on lineage, and Jesus never corrects them. He does not invoke his father's name. He does not defend his background. He does not appeal to family standing. He speaks as if none of that is necessary. His authority does not reach backward for validation. It moves forward with unsettling certainty. This is why the phrase, "Son of Mary," matters. It is not an insult. It is not a mistake. It is a signal. It tells the listener that something has changed. The familiar framework has loosened. The man standing before them cannot be explained by the usual rules. Joseph fades not with drama, but with language. By the time Jesus' public identity takes shape, Joseph exists only as memory, assumption, or implication. He no longer shapes how Jesus is perceived. The father who once anchored the story has quietly receded, leaving behind a gap, one that presses the question deeper. If he is not defined by his father on earth, then who defines him at all? The story does not answer yet, but it is preparing us to hear the answer. Joseph's disappearance was never the result of accident, neglect, or narrative convenience. It unfolded the moment a truth was established that could not be softened or reversed. From the very beginning, the story placed a boundary around Jesus' origin. His life did not begin through human will, human desire, or human lineage. Before he spoke a word or performed a single act, his identity was already fixed. He belonged to God. And once that claim stood, Joseph's place in the story became both essential and limited at the same time. Joseph was asked to occupy a position unlike any other figure in Scripture. He had to be a father, yet never the source. He had to protect, yet never originate. He had to give a name, a household, and legal standing, while knowing that the life entrusted to him did not come from him. He stood closer to the mystery than anyone else, yet could never step fully inside it. The story allows him to do what must be done, but no more than that. He anchors Jesus in history, in law, and in community. Through Joseph, Jesus enters the world with legitimacy and recognition. Without him, the child would have stood outside the accepted structures of society. Yet at the same time, the narrative carefully guards against allowing Joseph's role to drift beyond its boundary. This balance is fragile. If Joseph were emphasized too strongly, Jesus would become explainable. His authority would appear inherited, his wisdom shaped by household instruction, his mission the result of upbringing rather than sending. But if Joseph were removed too early, Jesus' humanity would lose its grounding. The story therefore walks a narrow path, allowing Joseph to stand fully in his role until the moment his presence would begin to blur the truth being revealed. That moment arrives quietly, without warning or ceremony. Jesus is 12 years old, found in the temple while his parents search anxiously for him. When Mary finally speaks, she uses the language of ordinary life, referring to Joseph naturally as "your father." Nothing about her words is wrong or careless. They reflect how life has functioned up to that point. But Jesus responds with a sentence that rearranges everything. He speaks gently, yet decisively, naming another father. He does not deny Joseph, but he places him in proper order. For the first time, God is explicitly identified as his father, not symbolically, not indirectly, but plainly. From that moment forward, the line is drawn. Earthly guardianship has done its work. Divine sonship now stands in full view. The narrative does not linger on family explanation, because explanation is no longer needed. Jesus' allegiance is no longer framed by household structure, but by heavenly origin. After this moment, Joseph is never mentioned again, and that silence is intentional. Once Jesus publicly identifies God as his Father, Joseph cannot remain visible without creating confusion. Every reference Jesus will make to the Father is central to his teaching, his authority, and his mission. If Joseph was still present, every word would require clarification. The story refuses to burden the listener with divided meaning. Instead, it removes the source of ambiguity. When Jesus speaks of the Father, there is no competing image. No earthly counterpart stands nearby. The absence does not simplify the message by reducing it, it clarifies it by sharpening it. Jesus' authority appears unborrowed and unmediated. His words do not rise from inheritance, but descend from heaven. This is why the story never pauses to explain Joseph's fate. Explanation would distract, clarification would soften the edge of what must now be heard. Silence preserves clarity. As the narrative moves forward, Jesus speaks as one sent, not trained. He does not appeal to upbringing. He does not invoke Joseph's name. He does not ground his authority in family memory. His teaching carries the weight of direct knowledge rather than accumulated wisdom. The absence of Joseph makes this unmistakable. It also explains why one account begins even earlier than birth itself, before family, before genealogy, before household entirely. There, identity is established in eternity. Joseph appears only as assumption, spoken by others, never confirmed by the narrative voice. The focus remains fixed, not on how Jesus fits into a family, but on how he reveals God. Joseph's disappearance serves this focus. The story is not merely recounting events, it is shaping understanding. It guides the listener away from familiar explanations toward a truth that resists ordinary categories. If Joseph remained, the line between human formation and divine origin would blur. So Joseph steps away, not erased, not dishonored, but completed. His task was never to remain visible. It was to make room, to establish what needed establishing, and then to disappear before he could compete with what the story must now proclaim. The guardian has done his work, the father has been named, and the story moves forward with clarity that cannot be compromised. Joseph's absence is not a loss to the narrative. It is his final act of obedience, written not in words, but in silence. As Jesus began to speak openly, a shadow followed him everywhere he went. It was not only resistance, it was not only doubt, it was something quieter and far more dangerous: misunderstanding. People did not rush to reject him at first. They watched, they listened, they tried to place him within categories they already understood, and the easiest category was also the most comfortable one. He must be Joseph's son, a skilled son perhaps, a thoughtful son, a carpenter who had learned wisdom at home before stepping into public life. That explanation felt safe. In the ancient world, sons carried their fathers with them. A man's voice did not stand alone, it echoed the house that raised him. Trades were inherited, authority was assumed, reputation followed bloodlines. When someone spoke with confidence, people instinctively looked backward, not upward. They searched for the father behind the words. This was how meaning worked. This was how identity was measured. And this is where the danger quietly took hold. If Joseph had remained visible, standing nearby, offering guidance, shaping direction, the story would have bent in a different direction. Every unsettling statement Jesus made could be softened. Every bold claim could be explained. His authority would not need to be confronted. It could be traced. Wisdom would become education. Power would become inheritance. Heaven would slowly dissolve into household influence. Jesus would still be impressive, but he would no longer be threatening. That is why Joseph cannot remain. Not because he lacks importance, but because his presence would invite the wrong explanation. The story itself seems to recognize this tension. As Jesus' voice grows sharper, Joseph's presence fades. The space where a father should stand is left deliberately empty. No replacement appears. No explanation is offered. And that emptiness begins to do something powerful. As Jesus teaches, people grow uneasy. They cannot locate the source of his authority. Where did he get this wisdom, they ask. The question lingers because the usual answers are gone. There is no visible father to credit, no mentor to reference, no lineage to lean on. The absence forces the question away from earth and towards something far less comfortable. That upward pull is essential. History would later prove how easily Jesus could be misunderstood. Some would argue that he was only a man chosen later by God. Others would say he became divine through obedience or ritual. These ideas did not emerge from nowhere. They grew naturally from attempts to explain Jesus without accepting what he said about himself. The story anticipates this danger long before it becomes doctrine, and so it removes the explanation before it can take root. By allowing Joseph to fade from view, the narrative refuses to anchor Jesus' authority in human development. Jesus is never shown learning how to speak with power. He is never portrayed receiving insight secondhand. His words arrive complete, unsettling, unfiltered. He speaks as if he knows because he does. That tone would collapse if Joseph stood behind him. An earthly father would soften the edges. He would offer context where the story demands tension. He would give comfort where discomfort is necessary. So Joseph disappears, not in rejection, not in shame, but in quiet completion. His absence sharpens what remains. As Jesus continues, his language grows more precise. He speaks of being sent, of doing the will of the Father, of returning to where he came from. These are not metaphors borrowed from family life. They are claims that resist ordinary explanation. They demand a different frame of reference. And notice what Jesus never does. He never appeals to Joseph. He never cites upbringing. He never points backward to explain himself. He stands alone, accountable only to the Father he names. This isolation is not accidental, it is protective. The silence surrounding Joseph shields the reader from false comfort. It prevents the mind from settling into easy conclusions. It removes the possibility that Jesus is simply the result of remarkable parenting or disciplined training. The story does not allow that escape. It presses harder. If he is not defined by his Father on earth, then who defines him? The silence becomes a boundary line. On one side stands the familiar world of inheritance, apprenticeship, and human authority. On the other stands something far more unsettling, a son whose knowledge does not rise from below. The story never argues this point. It shows it. Joseph's disappearance accomplishes what explanation never could. It closes one door so another must be opened. Without an earthly father to interpret him, Jesus becomes a mystery that cannot be resolved by biography or upbringing. The only explanation left points upward, and so the absence remains, not as a flaw in the story, but as its safeguard. Joseph steps back, and in doing so, protects the truth at the center of the narrative. The son must not be misunderstood. The voice must not be traced to the wrong source. What Jesus speaks does not rise from inheritance or training. It descends, and the silence makes certain we hear it that way. Long before theology asks its questions, history whispers its own answers. Nazareth was not a city of scholars or scribes. It was a small working village built on labor, routine, and survival. Life there was hard, measured not in years, but in endurance. Most men did not grow old in comfort. They wore their strength down day by day, trading health for bread. Joseph lived in that world. In first-century Judea, life expectancy was short. Disease, injury, and exhaustion claimed lives early, especially among laborers. A craftsman's work demanded constant physical effort, lifting stone, shaping wood, hauling materials under the sun. There were no safety nets, no medicine to soften injury, no rest once weakness appeared. A man worked until he could not. Joseph was one of those men. Years pass in silence between Jesus' childhood and his public ministry. The Gospels say little about this period, but history fills in the gaps. In a household like Joseph's, survival depended on the father's strength. And when that strength failed, responsibility shifted immediately to the eldest son. This is where the story begins to change. When Jesus later appears in public, people identify him simply as the carpenter. Not a teacher trained elsewhere, not a student returning home, a working man, someone who has spent years with his hands hardened by labor. This detail is easy to overlook, but it carries weight. Trades were passed from father to son. A son did not take over unless the father could no longer do the work. The title suggests transition. If Joseph was still alive and active, the trade would still be his. But Jesus bears the name instead. The implication is quiet but clear. The role has changed hands. The household has changed structure. Something has already happened before the story resumes. In Jewish society, the eldest son carried a heavy burden when the father died. He became provider, protector, and authority within the family. Younger siblings depended on him, the mother depended on him. Leaving the household was not an option. Duty came before calling. This reality explains what theology alone cannot. Jesus does not begin his ministry at 20. He does not leave home at the first sign of adulthood. He waits, year after year. Not because he lacks awareness of his calling, but because responsibility binds him. If Joseph died while Jesus was still young, the weight of the household would have fallen on him immediately. Someone had to work. Someone had to provide. Someone had to hold the family together. That someone was Jesus. The long, silent years in Nazareth are not wasted years. They are years of obligation, years of labor, years of waiting. The son who would one day speak to crowds first learned what it meant to carry unseen responsibility. He did not abandon his family to pursue destiny early. He stayed until the work at home was finished. Only when that responsibility was fulfilled did he leave. By the time Jesus steps into public view, his siblings are grown. The household no longer depends on him for survival. The timing is not mystical, it is practical. History aligns with purpose. Duty gives way to mission, and Joseph is nowhere to be found. If Joseph had been alive, the story would look different. A living father would have appeared at public moments. He would have been present when Jesus was challenged, when crowds gathered, when danger rose. Fathers did not vanish quietly when their sons were threatened. Yet Joseph is absent from every scene where his presence would be expected. The silence fits the historical pattern. Widowhood was common. Families adapted. Sons stepped forward. Life moved on. Joseph's death would not have been extraordinary, but the consequences of it shaped everything that followed. This historical reality does not weaken the theological story, it strengthens it. Jesus does not emerge as a detached mystic, untouched by ordinary hardship. He emerges as someone who has already carried weight, loss, and responsibility. The Son sent from heaven is also a son shaped by duty. The timing of his ministry reflects obedience not only to divine calling, but to human responsibility. History and theology converge here. Joseph's absence is not merely symbolic. It is consistent with the realities of the time. A laborer worn down by years of work, a household forced to adjust, an eldest son stepping into silence, taking on a role he did not seek, waiting patiently for the moment when he could finally leave. By the time Jesus begins to speak publicly, Joseph's work is already finished. Not because he was forgotten, but because history had already closed his chapter, and when Jesus finally steps forward, he does so not as a sheltered son, but as a man who has lived fully within the cost of ordinary life. The carpenter leaves Nazareth only after the house he inherited no longer needs him. History does not contradict theology here. It completes it. As the story moves closer to its darkest hour, the silence surrounding Joseph grows heavier, no longer quiet, no longer distant. It presses in, shaping the scene even before the cross comes fully into view. By the time Jesus is led to execution, Joseph's absence is no longer a question. It is a presence of its own. At the cross, everything converges. Pain, loyalty, fear, love. The moment is public and brutal, stripped of comfort. Soldiers stand watch with practiced indifference. Crowds gather, some curious, some mocking, some silent. A small group remains near enough to witness what others turn away from. And there, beneath the weight of execution, Mary stands. She does not stand beside a husband. She is not shielded by a family patriarch. She stands alone. In that world, this detail matters more than it first appears. Women did not normally appear in public moments of crisis without male protection. The Gospels do not explain this. They do not underline it. They simply show it. And the absence is unmistakable. At the moment when a father would be expected to stand beside a grieving mother, Joseph is nowhere to be found. His absence is no longer subtle, it is decisive. As Jesus hangs on the cross, struggling for breath, he looks down and sees his mother. He sees not only her grief, but her future. He sees vulnerability written into her posture. He sees a woman exposed in a world that offers little mercy to widows. And in that moment when pain dominates every movement and every word, he does not turn inward. He acts. He entrusts her to John. The words are simple, almost restrained. "Woman, behold your son. Behold your mother." The exchange lasts only seconds, but its weight is enormous. In that culture, care for a woman belonged first to her husband, then to her sons. Only when both were gone did responsibility pass outside the family. Jesus' decision makes sense only if one truth is already settled. Mary has no husband to return to. If Joseph were alive, this moment would never exist. Mary would have gone home to him. There would be no need for reassignment, no public transfer of care. Such an act would not only be unnecessary, it would be deeply inappropriate. A living husband would not be bypassed. The Gospels do not pause to explain this because explanation is unnecessary. The scene itself speaks. Joseph is already gone. Here, absence becomes evidence. No verse records Joseph's death. No burial is described. No farewell is given. Yet this single act confirms his absence more clearly than any written notice ever could. Jesus does what the eldest son does when the father is no longer there. He ensures his mother is protected, and still, Joseph does not return to the story. As Jesus dies, Joseph does not appear to mourn. As the body is taken down, Joseph does not claim it. As the tomb is sealed, Joseph is not mentioned. Others step forward, disciples, women, even unexpected figures, but Joseph remains absent. The narrative has moved too far forward for him to re-enter. This absence carries emotional weight. The cross is where family bonds are exposed under pressure. Mary's presence reveals enduring faithfulness and unspeakable pain. John's presence marks loyalty and transition. Joseph's absence reminds us that the story has already shifted beyond the household that once framed Jesus' life. The family structure that sheltered him in the beginning no longer defines him at the end. The narrative does not pause to explain this shift. It does not soften it. It simply moves forward. After the burial, the silence remains intact. When the tomb is found empty, Joseph does not search for answers. When Jesus appears to his followers, Joseph is not among them. The resurrection scenes are filled with recognition, confusion, fear, and joy, but never with questions about a missing father. The story assumes what it has already shown. Joseph no longer belongs to this phase. His role ended long before the cross was raised. Emotionally, this deepens the gravity of the moment. Mary stands at the cross not only as a mother losing her son, but as a woman who has already buried her husband. The cross does not introduce her to loss, it compounds it. The weight she carries is layered, accumulated, and unresolved. Narratively, Joseph's absence keeps the focus sharp. The cross is not framed as a family tragedy between father and son. It is not told through the lens of paternal grief. Instead, it becomes something larger: obedience, sacrifice, fulfillment. Joseph's absence prevents the scene from collapsing into human sorrow alone. Had Joseph stood there, everything would change. The emotional center would shift, the story would fracture. Attention would divide between earthly loss and cosmic purpose. The Gospels refuse that fracture. They allow the cross to remain what it must be, the moment where divine mission eclipses every other tie. By the time Jesus breathes his last, Joseph has already been removed from the narrative framework, not erased, not dishonored, completed. His absence allows the cross to speak with clarity that cannot be interrupted. The Son belongs fully to the Father now. The household that once sheltered him no longer defines him, and the silence surrounding Joseph, heavy, unresolved, and unspoken, confirms what the story has been telling us all along. Joseph's chapter closed earlier. The cross simply proves it. To understand why Joseph's story ends in silence, we must first understand what kind of stories the Gospels are and what they are not. They are not biographies in the modern sense. They are not complete life records. They are proclamations. Every line, every scene, every omission serves a single purpose: to reveal who Jesus is and why his life matters. The Gospel writers are not trying to satisfy curiosity. They are guiding the reader toward a destination. And anything that pulls attention away from that destination is carefully set aside. This is where Joseph's disappearance becomes meaningful. The Gospels practice an economy of detail. Years are compressed into sentences. Childhood becomes a paragraph. Decades vanish between verses. This is not carelessness, it is discipline. The writers include only what drives the story forward. Characters appear when they serve the message, and they exit when their work is done. Joseph follows this pattern precisely. His functions in the narrative are clear and limited. Once those functions are fulfilled, the story no longer requires him. Not because he lacks importance, but because the story has moved beyond what he represents. First, Joseph establishes Davidic lineage. Through him, Jesus is legally placed within the line of David. This is essential for messianic expectation. The promises, the prophecies, the long history of hope, all of it requires a lawful connection. Joseph provides that connection quietly, effectively, and without controversy. Once established, it never needs to be reasserted. Second, Joseph provides protection. In the earliest stage of the story, danger is immediate and physical. Threats come from rulers, from violence, from exposure. Joseph stands as the human shield between the child and destruction. He moves, acts, and responds at critical moments. But once Jesus reaches adulthood, that kind of protection is no longer the story's focus. The danger ahead will not be escaped. Third, Joseph validates the virgin birth. His acceptance of Mary without claiming biological fatherhood anchors the doctrine in lived reality. He embodies obedience without ownership. Once this truth is established, repeating it would weaken it. The narrative does not need to defend the virgin birth repeatedly, it needs to move forward. When these functions are complete, Joseph's narrative role is complete. At that point, explaining his death would not add clarity, it would add distraction. Imagine the story pausing to describe Joseph's illness, his final days, his burial. The reader's attention would turn backward, toward loss and resolution. Emotion would settle on Joseph, rather than rising toward Jesus' mission. The forward momentum would slow. The Gospels cannot afford that. Their direction is fixed. Everything points toward confrontation, rejection, sacrifice, and the cross. Introducing a death scene for Joseph would pull the narrative off course. It would invite sympathy and reflection where urgency is required. Silence keeps the story moving. This is why the writers never explain what happened to him. Not because they did not know, not because it did not matter, but because the explanation itself would interrupt the trajectory. Silence, in this case, is editorial control. The Gospels move with intention from origins to outcome. Once Jesus steps into public ministry, the story narrows. Relationships simplify, context thins. The narrative strips away everything that might soften the impact of what is coming. Joseph belongs to the beginning. The cross belongs to the end. Between those 2 points, the story must remain focused. There is also a deeper literary reason. The Gospels consistently resist grounding Jesus' authority in human relationships. Whenever someone attempts to define him by family ties, the narrative redirects. Whenever identity threatens to settle into familiarity, it is disrupted. Joseph's continued presence would reintroduce familiarity. A visible father would anchor Jesus too firmly in ordinary categories. The story refuses that anchor. It allows Jesus to stand increasingly alone, misunderstood, unsupported, and exposed. This isolation is not accidental. It is part of the design. The silence surrounding Joseph contributes to this isolation. By the time Jesus approaches Jerusalem, the household that once framed his life has vanished from view. No father, no family claims, only mission, only obedience, only the path ahead. The Gospels also trust the reader. They do not explain every absence. They assume attentiveness. They allow gaps to exist because those gaps push the reader to engage more deeply. Joseph's silence invites reflection without resolving it. It creates space for meaning rather than closing it prematurely. In literary terms, this is restraint at its highest level. The writers could have said more. They chose not to. They allowed Joseph to disappear because his disappearance serves the greater story. It keeps the focus sharp. It prevents detours. It ensures that when the cross comes into view, nothing competes with it. Joseph's story does not end with words. It ends with purpose fulfilled. When the canonical Gospels chose not to explain what happened to Joseph, they left a space deliberate, restrained, unresolved. For some readers, that space was acceptable. For others, it was unbearable. Questions lingered, curiosity grew, and over time, imagination stepped in where Scripture remained quiet. This is how legends begin. By the 2nd century, stories started circulating that claimed to reveal what the Gospels had left unsaid. These writings did not present themselves as speculation. They claimed authority, they promised answers, and at the center of many of them stood Joseph, no longer silent, no longer absent, but fully explained. One of the earliest and most influential of these texts is the Proto-Evangelium of James. In this account, Joseph is no longer a young or middle-aged craftsman. He is portrayed as an elderly widower with children from a previous marriage. When temple authorities seek a guardian for Mary, Joseph is chosen reluctantly, even fearfully. He protests his age. He insists that he is unworthy. The story emphasizes distance, distance in years, distance in desire, distance in biology. The purpose is clear. By making Joseph old, the text protects Mary's virginity. By giving him prior children, it explains the brothers of Jesus mentioned in Scripture. Every narrative choice serves a theological concern that later generations felt deeply. The silence of the Gospels had created uncertainty. The apocryphal writers responded with certainty. Another text, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, takes a different approach. Here, Joseph appears frequently not as a silent guardian, but as a confused and struggling father figure. Jesus is portrayed as a miracle-working child whose power often frightens those around him. Joseph attempts to discipline, instruct, and restrain him. He worries about public reaction. He fears rejection and danger. These stories humanize Joseph. He becomes relatable, anxious, protective, and often overwhelmed. The child Jesus fixes Joseph's mistakes, corrects his work, and displays divine power even in domestic settings. The goal is not historical accuracy, but emotional engagement. The silence of Scripture had left Joseph distant. These stories pull him close. The most elaborate portrait appears in the history of Joseph the carpenter. In this text, Joseph's life and death are described in intimate detail. He lives to an advanced age. He lies on his deathbed, fearful of judgment. Jesus sits beside him. Mary weeps. Angels are summoned. Joseph's soul is carried gently into heaven. The scene is tender, dramatic, and deeply devotional. This imagined death scene accomplishes something the Gospels never attempt. It offers closure. It gives Joseph an ending worthy of his faithfulness. It transforms silence into comfort. Readers are no longer left to wonder. Joseph is not just absent, he is honored, remembered, and rewarded. But this raises an important question. If these stories were so meaningful, why were they never included in Scripture? The answer lies not in their popularity, but in their purpose. The Church recognized early that these texts served a different function than the Gospels. They were not proclamations of Christ's identity. They were responses to curiosity, anxiety, and devotional need. They filled emotional gaps, not theological ones. Where the canonical Gospels practice restraint, the apocryphal texts indulge explanation. They answer questions the Gospels refuse to address. They resolve tension the canonical writers intentionally preserve. They expand family details, smooth difficulties, and provide scenes that feel satisfying but not necessary to the central message. This difference matters. The church did not reject these writings because they lacked beauty or meaning. Many were cherished, read, and retold for centuries. But they were not canonized because they shifted the focus. Instead of pointing relentlessly toward who Jesus is, they lingered on how his life felt. They softened the story. The canonical Gospels do not soften silence. They use it. They allow Joseph to remain unresolved because resolution would pull attention away from Christ. The apocryphal texts, by contrast, bring Joseph back into focus. They make him central again, old, gentle, righteous, and finally at peace. In doing so, they reveal something important about the human heart. We want explanations. We want endings. We want to know what happened. The silence of Scripture unsettles us. Legends comfort us. But the Church chose restraint over comfort. By refusing to canonize these texts, the Church preserved the narrative discipline of the Gospels. Joseph remains honored, but not expanded, respected, but not explained. His silence remains intact not because it is empty, but because it serves a higher purpose. The legends tell us what people wish to know. The silence tells us what Scripture chose not to say. And that difference is everything. The apocryphal stories stand as a mirror, reflecting the questions believers carried across generations. They show how deeply Joseph mattered and how unsettling his absence felt. But they also highlight the wisdom of the canonical choice. Some silences are meant to remain. Joseph's story did not need embellishment to have meaning. His absence was already doing its work. The legends fill the gap, but the gap itself was intentional. And in that intention, the canonical story remains sharper, leaner, and more focused, leaving Joseph where the Gospels placed him, faithful, finished, and quietly out of view. For a long time, Joseph remained in the background of Christian memory, almost as quietly as he lived within the Gospel story itself. The earliest generations of believers spoke little about him. Their focus was fixed elsewhere, on the resurrection, on persecution, on proclaiming who Jesus was in a hostile world. Joseph, already absent from the narrative, remained absent from early reflection as well. This silence was not rejection, it was continuity. The early church mirrored the restraint of the Gospels. Joseph was respected, but not expanded, honored, but not analyzed. He belonged to the beginning of the story, and the church was living in its unfolding aftermath. Attention stayed where Scripture kept it on Christ. Yet silence does not mean forgetfulness. As centuries passed and the church moved from survival to stability, believers began to look again at the figures who had stood quietly behind the central events. Among them, Joseph slowly emerged, not through doctrine first, but through devotion. Christians began to notice what the Gospels had shown all along: a man who obeyed without speaking, who protected without recognition, who completed his task and then stepped aside. This kind of faith resonated deeply. During the medieval period, devotion to Joseph expanded significantly. The church, now woven into daily life, began to honor not only martyrs and apostles, but models of ordinary holiness. Joseph fit this need perfectly. He was not a preacher or a miracle worker. He was a laborer, a husband, a guardian. His sanctity was expressed through responsibility, not spectacle. Art, prayer, and liturgy began to reflect this shift. Joseph was portrayed holding tools rather than scrolls, standing beside Mary rather than ahead of her, watching over the child rather than directing attention to himself. These images were not imaginative expansions. They were visual interpretations of the silence Scripture preserved. Over time, titles followed. Joseph became known as the patron of workers because he labored faithfully, the patron of families because he protected without possession, the patron of the church because he guarded Christ's body quietly, just as the church is called to do. Each title reflects not an action recorded in Scripture, but a pattern revealed through absence. Joseph's strength was not assertive, it was supportive. He did not define the mission, he made it possible. And when the mission no longer required him, he withdrew without resistance. This withdrawal is not weakness, it is theology lived out. The theology of stepping aside is rare. Most human ambition pushes toward visibility, influence, and legacy. Joseph moves in the opposite direction. He accepts a role that will never center on him. He carries responsibility without claiming authority. And when his presence could distract from what God is doing, he disappears. This disappearance may be Joseph's greatest act of faith. He does not insist on being remembered. He does not demand explanation. He does not re-enter the story to secure his place. He trusts that obedience is enough, even if history never records his ending. In a world that equates importance with attention, Joseph offers a different measure of greatness. He is faithful without applause, present without prominence, essential without being central. The church eventually recognized this, not by rewriting scripture, not by filling in the silence, but by honoring the silence itself. Joseph's veneration grew precisely because his story did not need embellishment. His absence became a mirror in which believers could see a deeper truth, that God's work is often carried forward by those who are willing to disappear once their task is done. This is why Joseph endures, not because we know everything about him, but because we know enough. We know that when God spoke, he listened. When danger came, he acted. When his role was complete, he stepped away. And in doing so, he left behind a testimony stronger than words. Joseph's legacy is not written in speeches or recorded miracles. It is written in silence, a silence that protects the mystery of Christ, a silence that refuses to compete with divine glory, a silence that teaches faithfulness without recognition. The man who vanished from the narrative never vanished from meaning. His absence did not erase him. It revealed him. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Joseph's life, that sometimes the truest witness is not found in what is said, but in what is willingly left unsaid. If this story helped you see Joseph and the gospel more clearly, please take a moment to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and thank you for staying with us until the end.